listening to The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare and related issues in the international security environment. The Trident is sponsored by the U.S. Naval War College's Center on Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, retired Army Colonel Dave Brown, and Director of the Center on Irregular Warfare here at the college. Welcome to the Trident. Today we are looking at the topic of election violence in the United States as we move into one of the most contentious election seasons in recent history. I'm joined today by Dr. Timothy Hoyt, Senior Professor at the U.S. Naval War College's Strategy and Policy Department. Professor Hoyt holds the John Nicholas Brown Chair of Counterterrorism, and he's also the Academic Director for the Advanced Strategist Program here at the college. His publications include articles on the war on terrorism in South Asia, the limits of military force in the global war on terrorism, military innovation and warfare in the developing world. And he's currently working on a book on American military strategy in the 21st century and a study of the strategy of the Irish Republican Army from 1913 to 2005. And we're also joined today, a guest to the college, Jacob Ware. Jacob is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he studies domestic and international terrorism and counterterrorism. Together with Bruce Hoffman, who's one of the world's leading experts on terrorism, he is the co-author of God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. In addition to his work at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jacob is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Waltz School of Foreign Service, where he teaches a class on domestic terrorism, as well as DeSales University. He also serves on the editorial boards for the academic journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and the Irregular Warfare Initiative that broke off from the Modern War Institute at West Point. And he was a spring 2024 visiting fellow at the University of Oslo Center for Research on Extremism. Welcome to you both. Earlier this year, we were joined by Jacob and his co-author, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, to discuss their book, God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. And that podcast we entitled Against All Enemies, The Rise of Far-Right Extremism in America. And we encourage you to listen to that discussion if you haven't already. We've invited Jacob back to the college to lecture, and he joins us today for a second edition, and we've entitled today's podcast, Playing with Fire, Election Violence in the U.S. 2024 and Beyond. I'm going to read a quotation from a recent article that you wrote. Quote, "Two attempted assassinations targeting former President Trump are part of a much broader trend targeting candidates for office. Assassination threats are not new, having blighted both the domestic and international political landscape for years now. Nor is domestic terrorism, which has become a major national security concern over the last several years. But counterterrorism scholars and analysts have predicted for months that the 2024 presidential election would provide a particularly volatile flashpoint for election violence. The near assassination of former President Trump demonstrates the accuracy of these concerns, but this is only part of the story. A month from the election itself, election of violence is already in full swing. And the only reason the carnage has not been worse is good police work and also better luck." Jacob, this is a quotation, as I said, from a recent article. How much is election violence grown beyond what we've seen in earlier election cycles, and how serious is this threat?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be back here, to be back on the show as well. The threat is serious. We have seen election violence already, as the article kind of explains, and we are likely to see election violence in the last couple of weeks before the election. Now, that sounds worse than it really is, because I think it's important to note we have seen election violence in the US over the past kind of 3 or 4 elections quite frequently. in the last midterm, there was a serious plot against the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that involved an individual breaking into her home. That cycle saw a similar attempt against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, again an individual making it all the way to the home. The presidential election before that, we know January 6th affected that election. The 2018 midterm, in the 10 days before that election, we saw no fewer than 4 far-right terrorist attacks, most notably the 2018 shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, deadliest anti-Semitic terrorist attack in US history. I mention this context because we've seen these issues rise before, we've persevered through these issues, and that does not mean that this is an existential threat as you might figure hearing us talking about election violence. But certainly the threat in the counterterrorism landscape is serious, and it's very much, I think, an all-hands-on-deck situation for those of us working in this space over the next few weeks.
But what is it about this particular election cycle that has fueled concerns over this issue? I mean, certainly, and I was thinking particularly about another piece that you wrote about how political language and rhetoric is driving this political context in at least language and rhetoric about existential problem sets, notions like political prisoners, things. How is that rhetoric and that language helping to drive a cycle of violence as we approach the election season?
Of course, the question of rhetoric's been in the news, right? Because after those 2 assassination attempts on former President Trump, the rhetoric, I think, was blamed. A little bit harder for me to accept that, maybe from a counterterrorism standpoint, because I'm not sure we really got clear motives on either of those shootings, especially the first one. But certainly the rhetoric, I think, is a problem, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of people in this space have warned about this election. Let me break that down into 2 parts. The first is existential language. So politicians on both sides of the aisle in the United States today, in the build-up to the 2024 election, are openly and freely trafficking in existential language. If we don't win this election, there's not going to be another election. Democracy is on the ballot.
Israel may cease to exist. I mean, there's a number of these, I think. So
the reason
this might be the last election that we have if we don't elect a certain candidate.
The reason politicians do this is simple. It's because they believe that the best way to drive turnout is to scare people, make them angry, make them passionate, drive turnout. The problem is, I think the line between driving turnout and driving other forms of political activism is quite thin. And so if you tell people this is the last election, and then you lose that election, people are going to be more likely to determine that political solutions are no longer viable for them, and they're going to turn to another form of activism, to include violent activism. I think that is why existential language is a problem. The other half of this I want to talk about is what I call the erosion of the taboo against violence in our society. This began really in 2017. It's a really important moment that happens in August 2017 when a group of white supremacists gathered in a university town called Charlottesville, Virginia, on behalf of an explicitly violent white supremacist cause. Somebody conducted a terrorist attack at that location, and then we had this very painful, very public back and forth in the media in the days that followed that ended with President Trump saying, very fine people on both sides. I know this is a controversial topic, but one of the things I'm proud of in my work is we try to avoid the partisan takes on this. We go to the source of what the people in the underground are saying. And this was a really important moment for people in the violent underground in America to say, we can conduct violent attacks on behalf of white supremacist ideology or anti-government ideology, and we'll receive protection. I think you've seen that in the aftermath of January 6th. January 6th is the largest investigation in FBI history. We have over 1,000 federal cases, including people prosecuted for seditious conspiracy, arguably one of the most serious criminal charges in our country. The government successfully proved that people intended to overthrow the government. And over the 4 years since then, the narrative has been switched around away from they're criminals, violent extremists towards their martyrs, their hostages, they are political prisoners. The most recent term I saw is warriors, which is a term that celebrates violence in organized ways. I think this is eroding that deterrence against violence. It's eroding the taboo against violence. And so people have stood there now in 2024 saying, why don't we act out in violence again? We know we're going to be protected by not the criminal justice system, but by the political system. And that's a big deal.
I actually, there was a piece in the article you co-wrote that kind of added to this. There were two terms that kind of stuck out as I read the piece. One is that you talk about the same thing. This heightened threat was partly because of a creeping normalization of this attitude in the American politic, and a mainstreaming of extremism. And it seems like that's part of what it is that you're describing at the moment.
I think so. And you have to look at this in two ways. One is ideology, and one is action. Ideologically speaking, there are certain elements which undergird truly extremist movements in our country that I think have mainstreamed. For example, Great Replacement theory, which is a conspiracy theory that argues that white people in Western countries are being replaced by immigrants and by minority political rights in a deliberate kind of coordinated transition orchestrated by Jews. So there's a Nazi element, and also kind of Marxists, Democrats, what have you. This conspiracy theory has inspired basically all far-right violence we've seen over the past 15 years. Attacks that the listeners will have heard about, will remember places like Oslo, places like Charleston, South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Christchurch, New Zealand, El Paso, Texas, Buffalo, New York. These are Great Replacement theory acts of violence. And we are now seeing these conspiracy theories mainstreamed with politicians and media figures saying, for example, Democrats are importing voters. It's the same narrative. And then, of course, that mainstreaming of the action is what we mentioned earlier, where violent rhetoric is now openly shared in public places in ways that I think are quite threatening to the liberal democratic project that we have fought for so hard in our country.
And all these trends are beginning to manifest themselves now in terms of polling in the last couple of years. The percentage of people who seem to be more willing to consider the use of violence to redress political problems or as an act of patriotism has been growing significantly since January 6th. Is that right?
And so I want to pull on that just a minute before you answer it. So we talked about that in our podcast, and I was actually very surprised, and I think it came out in some of your recent articles as well. I agree with Tim. That seems to have been growing, but I was amazed at what the percentages were when you said what they were on the last podcast, and we talked about that a little bit.
Various organizations, various polling organizations have done these surveys, and I think the last one I saw was done after we spoke. It was PBS. They say 20% of adults in America believe, the language is always different here, but believe violence can be justified to protect American values or to protect your political views or whatever.
Or I saw something, maybe it was from you, said something about, would it be necessary to fix whatever the problems are that you see in the American government? Would violence be necessary to fix those problems?
20% of adults in the last poll I saw, that breaks down as 12% Democrat, 28% Republican. Those are enormous numbers.
That's nearly 30% of one half of the political spectrum.
Those are people who seemingly have decided that if their political views fail to win the day at the ballot box, which is the fundamental tenet of what it means to be an American, then there are other ways, violent ways, to ensure that your political views are going to be advanced. I mean, it's completely antithetical, I believe, to what it means to have a thriving liberal democracy. I don't know how you can reconcile those two elements.
And I believe that you added to that the percentage is much higher, obviously, with gun owners and those that carry on a regular basis, that percentage of an attitude of whether or not violence would be necessary to fix problems in the government rises considerably past 28%. I think it was something on the order of 40 something, nearly 50% of people that own a large number of weapons would be willing to accept, perhaps, in this problem set.
One of the reasons I think those of us working in counterterrorism research, at least, I mean, I wouldn't be able to comment on the government analysis side, are so concerned is, we measure threats as some kind of factor of intent, capability, and opportunity. I'm sure at some point today we'll talk about the opportunity, but what you're really asking about there, you're really pointing out is the intent among people who already have the capability. So people who are gun owners have the capability to conduct an act of terrorism if they decide that they want to. That doesn't mean all gun owners are terrorists, of course.
Yeah. By the way, I'm former military and I am a gun owner, so
Yeah.
I mean I'm not anti-gun in any fashion. But again, I think with Tim, the percentages are alarming, and as you said, they're massive in terms of looking at the average American population or politic and saying that number of people on either side of the political spectrum might be willing to countenance violence if they don't get their way at the ballot box.
And that, I think, is a statement of intent. That is, that number is what I feel. I feel it tells a story of a moment in American politics. People's intent, people's willingness to condone, to accept, to conduct violence is just rising. It's rising in our country. And I think that is why we've seen high levels of domestic terrorism over the past 15 years, primarily perpetrated by individuals on the violent far right. It is hard to know how to reverse those trends. If people have kind of opened their mental aperture towards, I might have to be violent, it's hard to know how you unwind that. It's kind of the reason our entire field exists, right? And I think, I'm not sure, I mean, Dr. Hoyt, you might have better ideas, but I'm not sure what our field's answers are on how you actually achieve that.
Yeah. Well, de-radicalization has had mixed successes in many different societies. And it is long and complicated, and again, mixed successes. Here we're looking at the erosion of democratic norms. We're seeing them in other Western societies as well. I'd be interested in, can you make comparisons to other societies? Are you studying them as well as the United States, or?
Well, a lot of the trends we see here are rising in Europe as well. Yeah. In terms of democratic backsliding and an attendant rise in violence. The deadliest act of what you might call domestic terrorism over the past 15 years occurred, as I mentioned earlier, in Oslo. 77 people were killed there. In Christchurch in March 2019, 51 people were killed there. So this is not something that's unique to us. It is something that's broader. I think thinking about historical examples, one of the things that domestic terrorism experts are being asked a lot right now is this huge question with just enormous implications, which is, are we heading towards civil war? And I'll tell you, my co-author, Dr. Hoffman, and I come down on the side of no, because at least in our mind, I think we conceptualize civil war as, a U.S. civil war, and the reality is our country doesn't break down that way anymore. The divides we're talking about.
Not
geographically. Geographically.
Evenly mixed across.
It's more urban-rural. And so, the historical example we think of that's possible if we continue going down this path is something more akin to the Troubles that you've done your work on, where you have widespread, sustained violence between factions targeting the government and civilians. And of course, I mean, I don't need to tell you, that can be incredibly damaging to a country. You don't need to have that full-scale civil war that we're all kind of thinking about and that people are making movies about, to have a situation which is really destabilizing, both internally and also in terms of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. soft power. It's a frightening moment.
I'd like you to comment a little bit about the different time periods leading into the election. Some of your work indicated, and you predicted, along with some of your co-authors, that we would see violence on the campaign trail. And then you indicated there would be different kind of target sets prior to the election, during the campaigning, during the election itself, and then following a major election. Talk about that for a minute, and talk about if people that are interested in following these trends want to watch for elements of electoral domestic violence in the United States, where those kind of targets would be most likely seen.
So I wrote a report in my organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, in April, which was titled Preventing Election Violence in 2024. Now, obviously, I failed. My recommendations were not good enough. One of the things I did in that report was I tried to break down the temporal aspect. So, not just kind of thinking of election violence as a monolith, but how will this break down at different moments? In the period before the election, I felt that the threat was going to be to candidates. They are the most public, of course, expression of our political system.
And of course, we've seen that already.
Of course, we've seen that. So, to be completely honest with you, I don't think when I was writing this report in March and April that I was imagining what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. I mean, that is a catastrophic security failure and just a horrendously dark day in our country. It's one of those things that you just, I guess you can imagine it, but you can't really accept it as a possibility. It happened, so that was part of it. I worried about threats to the conventions.
Which didn't really, that is a question I had later, why didn't we see perhaps more violence at these major conventions where I thought perhaps we might, but...
It's an excellent question. I mean, I'd be interested in your view, actually, from the military standpoint. Maybe it's a question of it's a concentrated defense and sufficiently concentrated that nobody believed they could try. But I don't know. Maybe it was. I know in the Democratic convention case there was a lot of news before about disruptions that were going to come from the far left. So maybe people kind of just decided, we'll let that happen. That's going to be damaging enough. I don't have a good answer.
But it was true in terms of the prediction of candidates and the protection of candidates. I think you mentioned that some candidates ask for extra protection, so it's not just the ones that we've seen, but some of the ones that we haven't. So I know that Nikki Haley asked for security protection, and there's been others that have either on both sides that have asked for assistance. There's
a really important clarification there, which is the attack on President Trump at his golf course was kind of widely reported as the second assassination attempt on President Trump, and that is not true. That number is not true. President Trump has faced assassination threats for 10 years now. They come and go, right? Some are more successful, some are less successful. As far as I know, these are the only two that I can remember anyway that involved an individual arriving on site with capability. President Trump faces a deluge of threats, so does President Biden, so does Vice President Harris, so do state officials, so do senators and congressmen. So this is
and other candidates who they're running for office.
So this is a constant thing. That's why Nikki Haley requested Secret Service protection. I think Robert Kennedy Jr. requested Secret Service protection.
Yes. And we've had some people leave the field because at least they hinted at the fact that they received death threats or were concerned about violence against their own family.
Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, a superstar congressman, head of the China Committee on the Republican side, resigned, basically saying, I accept that these threats are part of the job, but it's not part of the job for my family. So he was facing threats to his home, his family.
I believe Mitt Romney's hired private security 24/7.
So in the build up to the election, all of these people are facing a massive volume of threats, and we've seen a couple of very high profile incidents involving former President Trump. But one of the reasons I wrote the article that that you quoted from at the start is I wanted the article is titled "Election Violence is in Full Swing," and I wanted to kind of make the argument and put down on paper the extent to which we are just seeing a massive volume of threats, and people have been arrested. Some people have been, have been unfortunate in their plotting, or have failed because of some basic issue. The issues with the attacks on President Trump are the violent, the kind of public edge, but there is a whole drumbeat happening underground.
And what happens when the election process begins? Where does that emphasis shift to primarily?
In my analysis, I predict that it will shift towards voting centers. One of the recommendations I make in my report, very simply, is just trying to encourage people to vote early, because if you're going to take a very kind of raw, pure counterterrorism view on it, it would be good if these polling places are less busy on November 5th or 6th, if there are less people there. And
I was struck by the fact that you kind of mentioned two groups. One is voters themselves. We've seen voter intimidation at various places around the country. Some maybe in a sense good intentions, but we've had militias and other people show up armed as if they're protecting voting centers, but perhaps intimidating voters in the process. But voters could be targeted. Voting places could be targeted, and obviously election officials that are counting ballots, or if someone gets angry because the vote doesn't happen a particular way in a particular county or a particular state, could be angry at those that have responsibility for the ballots themselves. And so I think voters, voting places, and election officials all kind of come under that perhaps target of violence orientation.
On the public officials, the elected officials point, let me give you a piece of data. There is a team that tracks these numbers out of the University of Nebraska, Omaha. The group is called INCITE, N-C-I-T-E. They're reporting that we've already reached a record number of threats to public officials this year, and a large part of that is election officials at the local level, who are just trying to, they might be volunteers, they're just trying to get the democratic process running, trying to make sure everything is squared away, and they're being threatened basically out of the process, which is very concerning. Yes, that is how things will shift. I think during the election and then immediately afterwards, we'll see a threat shift towards polling places and vote tallying centers. Now, one thing that's really difficult, Colonel Brown, is, and something I struggle with a lot in my work, is trying to raise alarm about something without being alarmist. And I don't want our listeners to think that they now can't go to the ballot box to vote.
Exactly.
It's like we've always said after terrorism. When attacks happen, when people try to intimidate, the right approach is to double down. Embrace your democracy, be proud of it, and fight for it. It's not to turn away. So, I think we're in an elevated threat environment heading in. That doesn't mean that we can hide from our duties as American citizens, and we have to participate in the election. That's how we
but state officials and federal officials can also harden targets and be more aware that these places are vulnerable, and on the day of election and processes to protect those involved in that process. And then after election, though, you said that some of that targeting might turn towards American institution or government institutions. So now if someone is upset, enraged at the outcome of an election, they could target inauguration, or they could target the process that we saw targeted on 6 January of the last election cycle, to prevent ratification, things like that.
One thing that worries me, and it's kind of a funny anecdote, before 2020, I had no idea what January 6th was. Right? It's pretty sure it's a purely ceremonial, basically, date, in the process. I don't think there's really anything about that date that should have attracted the attention and the violence it did, except just violent momentum. Just people got swept up and they targeted that location on that date. I think there are other moments in the process that can be that kind of flashpoint. one of the recommendations that I make in the report, and this one did come, not claiming credit for it, but this one did come to fruition, was designating January 6th as a national special security event, along with the conventions and I think Election Day. That means that more resources are deployed. It means I think the Secret Service is the lead agency. That's good news. That will help us kind of erect a stronger defense. But I really don't know if there's anything particularly special about January 6th that made that the day in 2021 that was the event, or if it's just one in a calendar of days that could be the next one should violent actors determine that they want to do something similar again.
I think there's also disrupting at the state level, the counting or the assigning of electors and their voting. We saw an attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan.
Oh, that's true.
So, we think mostly about the federal level because those days are sort of the ones that stick in our head the most and the ones that are most public. But again, interfering in the state, at the state level or even at the local level with ballot counting and things like that could disrupt the process enough to have an outsized effect.
I know that in our last podcast with you and Dr. Hoffman, we talked a little bit about where elements of some of the extremism comes, particularly on the right. And you mentioned, that there was an enormous growth of militias in the country, and there is some concern because many of those that join militias have some sort of veteran or military background, and so they have training in weapons, and now you have both organized groups and capable groups relative for enacting violence. How many militias, are there in the states, and how well organized and trained are they for these type of concerns?
Really difficult question for two reasons, and then I'll try to answer it. One is most violence that we see today in the US is lone actor. So to give you an example of the kind of incident I was fearing, one thing we didn't mention when we spoke about the pre-election was President Trump's court process. I was really worried that would be a flashpoint. And of course,
for the federal cases against him,
yes,
outside or at a court.
Yes.
Right.
In 2022, when Mar-a-Lago was raided, a lone actor tried to target the FBI headquarters in Cincinnati with a firearm and ended up losing his life in a shootout. Those are the kind of activities I worry about most, is the lone actors who are engaged in this space. They are probably developing extremist ideas and they have the capability to conduct violence, and the actual process of mobilization can then happen very quickly.
And it's also very difficult to track if they're by themselves because there's not as much communication process for the FBI or other agencies to monitor. So
now the counter argument to that is January 6th involved groups, individuals, and networks of people, and obviously that was a lot more damaging to our democracy than a single incident in Cincinnati. So maybe there's a proof of concept for militia groups to go and launch attacks. However, the most prominent organized militia groups that were active on January 6th, the leaders of those groups have faced very serious criminal charges and are in prison. So maybe that's evidence that they will kind of back down and go back. So it's really difficult to say whether individuals are going to look to act in groups or as individuals. I think that's part of the confusion, that we just don't have a clear picture of that. So in terms of how many armed militias there are, I've seen estimates in the thousands with members of militias in the tens of thousands. But I think we live in a landscape where one person can conduct a very damaging act. Just to get back to what Dr. Hoyt said a second ago about state level too, I do think we have to have, when you look at the data of some of the violence that we saw in 2020, the reality is there are also certain locations in this country that are particular flashpoints, and it goes down to more granular level. So I know the election officials in a place like Maricopa County, Arizona, have faced a really difficult time. Georgia, I think it's Cobb County, they faced a really difficult time. Philadelphia, if you remember, Philadelphia was the location in 2020 where the final votes were being tallied, and that's where it was going to be that's where it was going to be announced. And a couple of QAnon members from Virginia traveled to that location with firearms and were apprehended.
And we know where some of the militia groups are headquartered, Idaho, other places. They have historically been active in having strong, organized militia groups as well.
So I do think it's worth, sparing a thought for that. We think of elections as a federal thing, as you mentioned, and that's true, but there are also, the reality is this election comes down to 5 or 6 counties, and those counties are going to be mentioned a lot, in the first couple of weeks of November, and they're going to get a lot of attention, and I would suspect that they're going to get a lot of threats to them, regardless of which way the election goes, frankly.
Do you think that we'll see any other repeat of massed crowds in D.C. or at the seat of government during the presidential cycle? Or do you think that because some of the leaders have been incarcerated and because of what happened 4 years ago, that we're unlikely to see some of that? I know that's a tough question or a prediction.
I think there are definitely lessons learned from January 6th, which will be taken very seriously. My co-author, Dr. Hoffman, is always very keen to correct people when they say January 6th is an intelligence failure, because it wasn't an intelligence failure. Like, I had the intelligence in an unclassified setting. We knew there was going to be something big happening.
Right.
It's a failure to respond. And so I would be stunned if there was a failure to respond again. Now, my understanding is one of the reasons why there was a failure to respond is because the government is very concerned about appearing to have a militaristic response to protests. Understood. But obviously, there is a line at which protest becomes...
Right. So there is a freedom of speech, there's a freedom to assemble. Yet when that turns violent, there's not a freedom to commit certain acts of violence, and there is a line of determination and judgment there at both the local level and at the federal level.
So I would hypothesize, all the things that went wrong in the build-up to and on January 6th, from insufficient law enforcement mobilization to delayed National Guard response. I don't think any of those things will be factors this time. I just can't believe that those threats wouldn't be taken more seriously. Of course, there are more vulnerabilities at the state level, I think, and so part of the challenge is, I mentioned earlier, you think of counterterrorism threats. You think of terrorism threats as a factor of intent, capability, and opportunity. The third thing is opportunity, and part of the thing we're talking about here with candidates is we are dealing with a massive number of opportunities for violence, locations, candidates, polling places, vote tallying centers, state houses, government buildings, courthouses. We're dealing with a massive volume of opportunity. I think that is the real vulnerability, is even if we wanted to have a super militaristic response here, where we activated the National Guard and law enforcement in ways that are just damaging to free democracy, even if we wanted to do that, we couldn't, because the threats range so broadly. I think that is why the level of concern is so high.
Well, a somewhat positive note is that we do see, although rhetoric remains extraordinarily hostile at the national level of elections, we do see state leaders from both parties now beginning to step in and try and mediate or ameliorate some of the most outrageous statements, or at least qualify them, and restore some both civility but also sort of traditional sense of community to the electoral process again. We see Mike DeWine in Ohio coming out and talking about Haitian immigrants in Springfield and saying that the rhetoric that you are hearing, the memes that you are reading are wrong. Here is what the truth is. We see Governor Cox in Utah with the Disagree Better initiative. There are some people who are trying to get back in touch with their better angels and try and find a way to put more of a lid on the rhetoric. Are you optimistic about that at all?
I would like to be, yes. I think it's going to be a challenge as long as you have prominent politicians who counter that.
Yeah.
I do think that is something like Disagree Better, which is, Utah Governor Cox and Colorado Governor Polis, Republican and Democrat chair and vice chair of the Governors Association. That's absolutely the kind of initiative we need, where people can just say, listen, we're not going to agree on immigration policy. We're not going to agree on abortion policy. We're not going to agree on foreign policy. Can we agree on how we're going to disagree?
Or can we agree not to have violence in the public space over
these
election
disagreements.
outcomes, right? So.
But I think unless we truly have a bipartisan commitment to that goes all the way to the top, I just don't know if that will make great inroads. I'm really happy those kind of initiatives exist. The other thing I think is really important and is another huge challenge in terms of trying to unravel some of these issues is just information, right? It's just countering bad information with good information. One of the things that I really, really worry about is artificial intelligence and deepfakes. I think one of the issues that the violent, far right faced in 2020 and 2021 was the big cause that they were fighting for, which was, the election being stolen. It wasn't true, and they had no evidence. This time they'll have the evidence. I've said this a few places. This time you are going to have videos that emerge in the event of a Kamala Harris victory. You're going to have audio emerging of Kamala Harris and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi talking about how they stole the election. And then you're going to have videos that show where they burnt the ballot boxes. And you're going to have other videos of, bags being carried out. And you're going to have videos of all kinds of stuff that shows electoral fraud. It's going to be produced in real time. It's going to be good. And we're probably not going to have a really good defense against it.
By the way, stay tuned for the Trident audience. We're going to do a podcast in a few weeks with a company that's set up to work with the government on this exact issue with the FBI and other elements of the government of how to do forensic evidence detection of unraveling deep fake technology. And I think it's an adjunct to this conversation and a very, very important one. I want to go back on the positive side for a minute. We'll come back to that in a second. But I mean, pulling on Tim's point about, there are these, we have some leaders, a few, that are trying to change the dialogue. It could be, too, that we didn't see massive disruption of the conventions. We didn't see some of the violence that might have been predicted at the federal buildings where the court cases were being held. We've seen another country, I mentioned Venezuela. It's very likely that election was stolen, and yet instead of the country erupting into civil war, there's some sort of passive effect there to say, we know that the election was stolen, but they haven't erupted in terms of massive violence in the country. And I'm wondering if after January 6th, whether or not we'll see something similar, that there's not going to be the appetite for large, massed, violent gatherings, but there will still be massive discontent and unbelief in the outcome.
I think a lot of that will depend on the messages that come out of the parties. On the Democratic side, electoral defeat, I would expect to be met with fear and consternation and disbelief and anger, but I don't think you will have violent statements issued by leaders. On the Republican side, I think you would see what you saw in 2020. You would see allegations of fraud, and part of the problem is we talk sometimes in prevention work in counterterrorism about this cliche, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That has been the model that has been adopted by the electoral fraud kind of crowd. They're pre-bunking free election results. They're already. They're already saying it's stolen. One of the things I really worry about.
So if I don't win, you will know that it was faked or it was stolen.
It's unlocking confirmation bias. One of the things I really worry about, and we haven't even touched on this, I think it's a huge danger, is that replacement theory and the mainstream we spoke about earlier. You now have prominent politicians and media figures openly declaring that Democrats are importing voters from Latin America to legalize them to vote for the Democrats to create a one-party state. That is being shared by Elon Musk on Twitter, the owner of Twitter. It was hinted at in the debate. Again, on the pre-bunking point, so now if you have a situation in which Kamala Harris wins the election with winning a large portion of the Latino vote, the spotlight has already been put on the community that is supposed to be blamed.
And let's come back to the point that the two of you were making a minute ago about the AI. If that's added with fake news and well-developed, artificially intelligent driven products that look real, I guess this also kind of goes back to something else we talked about in our other podcasts, is this theory of acceleration. Could you have certain events or certain people that take that kind of attitude? It really was stolen. We have new information. We have new evidence and proof, even though some of it's not true. And the idea of acceleration is that there are actors that would attempt to accelerate violence in order to generate a larger violent outcome. Are you worried about that?
Of course, those actors exist. I mean, accelerationists tend to often leads itself to somewhat chaotic targeting profiles. For example, a true accelerationist might attempt to assassinate President Trump, knowing that is what would really lead to a huge conflagration, thinking that it's in that civil war environment that we will emerge victorious. So I absolutely think that's a possibility. There are actors that have that mindset. With the election element itself, in terms of the vote and stuff, the thing that gives me optimism, the thing that gives me positivity is, again, the antidote to misinformation is information. There are polling places that are opting for what they call radical transparency. So we'll give you all the information. We're not hiding anything. You can come here and watch. You can be part of the vote tallying process, engage in democracy. You'll see nothing is awry here. That is, I think, how you'll kind of unravel some of these very dangerous threads. And on the AI front, on the deepfake front, as people spread those, again, the only solution we have is information. Now, I've seen surveys or I guess experiments that say up to 70% of Americans can spot a deepfake. That's pretty good.
That may change, though, with the technology and the ability to see whether or not it's truly fake or not.
The technology exactly is getting better, and also that's still 30% of people, 30% of Americans who might watch a deepfake video of Kamala Harris explaining how she and Nancy Pelosi stole the election and believe it, and believe that their country is, to go back to that existential language, to believe that their country, their democracy is really on the ballot. The AI and deepfake front, that is the area where we with the exception of just a massive information, digital literacy campaign to train people, these are the things that you need to be watching for. These are the telltale signs. Short of that, we really don't have any response, I don't think.
I mean, the other part of this is on the bad side. There's been a lot of reporting in the fact that things that are arguably truly false have been debunked, have been clearly put out to the American public, and yet large percentages of the population, if it doesn't agree with their political outlook or their political leaders' outlook, that they've been unwilling to accept the truth of those statements, even in the face of clarified evidence. And so, what's the sensational reporting? What's the likelihood of us reining in these conspiracy theories, sensational reporting, and electoral legitimacy, given the fact that a lot of the electorate's not swayed by even facts in some cases, and I think we're seeing more of that.
Really curious to Dr. Hoyt's views on this. I think this is where, if I wasn't pessimistic enough already, this is where I get really pessimistic, because I think, so you mentioned our book at the start. Our book ends with the recommendations chapter where we issue short, medium, and long-term solutions. And I thought they were good, but then as kind of the book was out in the world and I spoke about those recommendations a lot, I started to notice they are really naive. And a lot of the recommendations we make in our work in domestic counterterrorism, I think, are naive. We talk about things like digital literacy programming, so giving people the tools to spot information, bad information online. We talk about mental health programming, let's say. We talk about social media reform. And all of these things are all about giving people the tools to be able to live healthier lives online, to be able to, live safer lives online. What if they don't want to? People are...
What if they don't, or what if they refuse to believe regardless in the face of factual evidence? And I think we've seen a wave of that kind of attitude in at least portions of the voting public, which is very concerning, I think.
I'm going to raise a slightly uncomfortable option, but I'd be curious as to your thinking about it. We, especially at the beginning of the century, terrorist experts began talking a great deal about super-empowered individuals. Is it possible that both former President Trump and Elon Musk are examples of these kinds of super-empowered individuals? And when they leave the stage, will then this movement, which has solidified behind them, not necessarily through their own diabolical planning, but a confluence of many different factors in American society, does it then unravel? Is there then a chance for a reset? Because I think Donald Trump is a unique presidential candidate in American history. He has been willing to face a whole series of political traditions, take them on, and defeat them. But he's also 78 years old. And he has said now that if he loses this election, he will not run again. Is it possible that much of the momentum of this movement is locked in behind figureheads, and if those figureheads are displaced or deteriorate, that then the momentum of the movement begins to peak and other countermeasures can come into play?
I think it's quite possible. One of the really interesting things I think has happened over the past few years is usually in American politics and politics abroad, I assume, when a party loses an election, they have some kind of reckoning, right? They have some kind of, what did we do wrong? And I think, after the Democrats lost in 2016 to this surprise, uprising, the thing they really reflected on was, the basket of deplorables approach to democratic politics, which was, we're the urban elites, and if you don't believe what we say, if you are attracted by these other things, you must be deplorable. And so they went ahead and they ran a white man from Pennsylvania who's, plain as can be. The Republicans have lost pretty much every election since 2016. But they never had that reckoning because, of course, they didn't lose the 2020 election. They didn't lose in 2022. They won, but it was stolen from them. So the answer isn't to have that kind of, process of soul searching. It's to double down. I have to believe that if the doubling down fails again, that there would be some kind of reassessment of the direction that party has decided to head in. But I don't know. I mean, another element I think that would support that is, and it goes back to what we mentioned earlier. J.D. Vance was the kind of heir apparent, and did not have a particularly successful rollout. I mean, President Trump is enormously charismatic in ways
Yes.
that I don't think anybody else has been able to match. To go back to the conversation about the conspiracy theories, we just saw this play out on the public stage with Springfield, Ohio, where some truly outlandish, super racist conspiracy theories were aired, including in a presidential debate. The vice presidential candidate then came out and said, and I think this is a direct quote, "Sometimes we have to make up stories to get people to understand the threat to Americans. Sometimes we have to make up stories." And even when they openly admitted it was fake, in that process, people still believe because they want to. They want to believe. They want to be part of this movement. That is why, I worry about some of the recommendations that people like me make. They're optimistic, and sometimes I get pessimistic and cynical and think maybe people want to be in these spaces where they're defined by being an outsider. They're defined by anger, hatred in some cases. That's hard to unravel. It's hard to know how you put that back in the box.
So I have two scenarios that I want to ask you about. I think two are negative, and then one maybe is positive. And let's see what both of you think about these. So, one, what do you think would be the impact if a major candidate was assassinated before the election on large-scale political violence in the United States? We came close with President Trump. I mean,
who and how would matter a great deal. We haven't mentioned it, but there was also an assassination threat to President Trump that came from Iran in the form of a foreign national who is now in custody. Who is assassinated and who does the shooting and what we can find out about them, those are unknowables, but they would be enormously consequential, right? In the cases of the two attempts against President Trump so far, it is not, neither of these shooters appear to be, from the other, committed actors from the other side of the political spectrum. They are more like lone actors who have been radicalized by something. But they are not easily, pinnable as the enemy.
As partisan,
If a partisan assassination could be very disruptive, enormously disruptive. And I think to get a sense of that, just looking at the response of people in both parties, because there are factions in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, who look at the fact that Vice President Harris is now the candidate without having won primaries, that she was sort of anointed before the convention. That's already, that has created a significant amount of political churn in the system. An assassination would create much more, I suspect.
I think a partisan assassination would be catastrophic. I think my pessimistic counter-argument would be, I remember when President Trump was nearly assassinated. I mean, with what my X account looked like on that day, right? People weren't waiting around to find out.
No.
He survived. That's what made people step back. Thankfully, but if he hadn't survived, I don't think people would have waited to find out if he was a partisan actor or not.
And it was incredibly close. I mean, someone died behind him from an assassin's bullet, and it certainly came within inches, of killing him.
It's completely unthinkable.
But I do think that if either one of the major candidates is assassinated prior to the election, the conspiracy theory on the other side would be massive in terms of why that occurred and who had conducted it.
And I think we also shouldn't rule out, it might not be a presidential candidate, but as of July, there had been over 8,000 threats against congresspersons. There had been over 450 threats against judicial figures. I mean, in terms of public figures who are engaged in positions of authority, as we were talking about earlier, there are an awful lot of targets out there. We've seen an attack against the home of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. We've seen an attack against a senior member of the Republican leadership, Scalise, in 2017. I mean, there are vulnerable major figures in parties and in our government who are out there all the time who are at risk.
And I would agree with that, but my slight counter-argument would be that there's so much emphasis on the presidential election and this particular presidential election as an existential direction that the country could go in either direction. And I think that existential rhetoric at the very highest levels of both parties is rife with a prairie fire, and if one of them were to be assassinated, I think conspiracy theories would go out of the room. Here's another one. So President Trump gets elected, and he immediately pardons all of the convicted participants of 6/11/2020. What do you think the impact of that kind of action would be in terms of in the groups that you study and are thinking about, because the federal government has convicted them for actions taken on that day, and if that was undone, does that give license, I guess, in a way? Are you worried about that at all?
I think it gives license. I mean, it excuses political violence. I think a lot of it depends on, you got to ask the targeting question. So how does that change a targeting scenario? Who would those people go after? I'll tell you, my nightmare scenario is we've been promised that a second Trump campaign comes with, second Trump administration comes with widespread deportations. The word they've used now is remigration. That is almost certainly going to be either unconstitutional or impossible. I worry about people taking that into their own hands, and you end up with basically an ethnic cleansing scenario where people decide they're going to cleanse their communities of people considered impure or different or un-American, releasing violent actors into the community would scare me in that regard. The other element, and this is to I guess challenge the question somewhat, is the overwhelming majority of people arrested for crimes on January 6th have already been released. These were not long prison sentences. Some people got long prison sentences for sedition or for assaulting police officers, but the overwhelming majority got trespassing, interruption of a government procedure. So those people are largely back in the system. Some of them are very reflective about what they did, and have kind of come around to the notion of not attacking the government if the government doesn't do what you want it to do, but others have not had that.
So it might not have.
Some of them are running for Congress, right?
Right.
I mean, I think it's more about the message. The message is, you can launch an attack on the government, you can attack police officers, you can set off the largest FBI investigation in its history, and you will be forgiven, you will be pardoned, you'll be celebrated.
Well, let me come back to a positive note. So I read a piece, I think it was David Brooks, New York Times, analyst of some political affairs, whether you agree with David Brooks or not. He wrote a piece recently. He had been traveling around the country, and basically he said that in his opinion, it might be possible that we're seeing something different in the Geist, the age, basically that people were growing tired of this kind of violent rhetoric and acrimony in the political system, and that this comes in sine waves. And it perhaps is possible that you see voters pulling away from this negative, divisive rhetoric at the highest levels and want to pull back to a more conductive or bipartisan, calming situation. What do you take about in that in terms of possibility?
I think, again, this is, there's no predictable geography here. there are going to be places where there's still going to be a great deal of anger, angst, frustration that manifests itself. Much of it has manifested itself in support for former President Trump, for MAGA, for ideas like this. I mean,
Well, we'll be there in part of the population, regardless of who gets
exactly,
elected, right?
exactly. And I mean, I think when they've done polling, they've seen somewhere about a third of voters seem to be still firmly adhering and becoming the major influencers of the Republican Party right now. I'm not sure that goes away. But I think we may be seeing signs, that it is burning itself out. I mean, some of this is demographic, right? Many of the most passionate advocates of right-wing politics and violence are older white men. And in our society these days, with healthcare, with COVID, with everything else, older white men live a lot longer than they did in the 1930s, but it is an aging demographic. I think one thing that will be interesting to see and will play out in a peaceful political way, President Trump has come out and urged people to vote early. Despite all the rhetoric about people voting early or somehow cheating, he's come out and he's urged Republicans to vote early. It will be interesting to see if David Brooks is right. One would think one would see a lapse at the polls out of exhaustion. And one interesting thing to look at after the election is over is, was there really a lapse at the polls? If there was what appears to be a lapse at the personal polls, was it as we mentioned earlier, ideas of safety, but B, has the number of Republicans who chose to vote early gone up substantially? Have voting patterns shifted? We don't really know. And probably no matter what the answer is, some people won't believe it because there will be write-in votes, and some people will say somehow something phony happened. But I think that may be an interesting way to confirm David Brooks's hypothesis, would be to look and see, did people just not turn out? Because if they don't turn out, they're expressing the fact that they are tired of this politics. And we've had very high turnouts the last few elections.
Well, as we conclude this episode, I'd like to go back around the room. I mean, obviously, I think one of the things I've really drawn from this is to kind of watch, do we have accelerants? Do we have conspiracy theories, concern about the technology? And we are entering a very divided country in a very important race that I think people on both sides of the political aisle, wherever you find yourself, believe that there are some existential issues involved. Will we see an accelerated amount of political violence even between now and the election? And just last thoughts as we conclude today on not only political violence in this season, but going forward. And we'll start with Dr. Hoyt, and then we'll go to Jacob and conclude.
Well, again, there are an awful lot of unknown unknowns out here. But what I would say is it seems inarguable that trends towards political violence in the United States have increased significantly, probably since President Obama was first elected, and that those trends have been going up, and that's dangerous. What we were discussing earlier, the idea that you can intimidate voluntary public officials who simply want to man the polls, and you can intimidate them with threats of violence, is at some level a significant threat to democracy, an interruption of the way that the system should be able to work. And if you read New York Times articles and articles in the mainstream media, they'll have accounts of older women who are suddenly being harassed by their neighbors who they've known for decades simply because they have chosen to volunteer for a position and man the polls. That's disturbing. On the other hand, I think we're a long way away still from the kinds of political violence that we've seen in other societies. There are many steps before we get there. There are things that could accelerate it, absolutely. How it manifests itself in the future, I don't really know, but that's one of the reasons that I asked earlier, the sort of hypothetical, is this concentrated around a couple of individuals? Whether they're leaders or not, if it's concentrated around individuals, then whether President Trump wins or loses, he won't be in a position of authority for very long. And then there may be a reset. I don't know that for sure. On the other hand, we also hear the kind of deep concern that if he wins, democracy will go away. I think we are at a more dangerous moment than we've been at for a while. There was political violence in the United States in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, that surrounded the political system and could have affected the electoral process. This is another significant episode, maybe more significant. But I confess I am still optimistic that our system and our people will weather this storm and move through it. It just may take some time and it may be uncomfortable.
Jacob, I know I say this about the security studies field, it's a growth industry because there's going to always be national and international security concerns. You work in this area. What are your last thoughts about political violence and election violence in particular?
Am I allowed to be optimistic as well, or is that?
You're allowed to.
Okay.
Whatever, Jacob. Thanks.
We've got a couple of weeks left here before the election. We are going to see violence. I don't see any scenario where that's not true. That doesn't mean it's catastrophic. And I think we have a very robust counterterrorism bureaucracy, very professional that are working on this. Let them work. What I would like to finish with is my own personal recommendations for just listeners, as coming from somebody who deals with a lot of trauma at work. Vote and be proud of that and celebrate it with your community. And what I'm going to do, Colonel Brown, is I'm going to plan something fun and nice for myself in early February, because you know what, we're going to get there, probably, almost certainly we'll get to February. Things will be okay, we'll be intact, we'll have a new administration, and I think it's worth giving yourself a lodestar if you're worried about these things. Give yourself a lodestar in February to say, that's the thing I'm looking forward to, we will get there, we will be okay. And we just have to weather this storm right now, and hopefully we can do so together rather than in a way that's divided.
Well, they say that democracy survives one generation at a time, and but I also believe that leaders at all levels, including at our levels, should champion the legitimacy of our process and the legitimacy of voting in the system and letting that system take place properly. In the United States, and the peaceful transition of power, however that occurs. Dr. Hoyt and Jacob, thank you for a tremendous discussion. I think on the growth and significance of both realized and potential political violence in our country as we move into this important election season. Truly appreciate both of you providing your insights on this important topic and this important edition of the Trident, Playing with Fire, Political Violence in the U.S. in 2024 and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare. Opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. Please find us at www.usnwc.edu/CIWAG and consider subscribing to our bi-weekly newsletter, The Patrol, or listen to further episodes of The Trident. Until next time.